Hello, hi everybody, and welcome to the Ruby Behind Chef. My name is Franklin Weber. I'm a training lead here at Chef. Let's do a little introduction, let every one of you get seated, sit up, and ready to go, and then we'll start this wonderful presentation. So like I said, my name is Franklin Weber. I'm a training and content lead here at Chef. Occasionally I call myself a trainer. I've got a history of working with technical content and training for a little while here, and mostly, but probably more importantly, is thinking about my Ruby career. So I've been a Ruby developer for a number of years, and I would just say Ruby is my current favorite language, and mostly the one that I look to when I start to, wake up in the middle of the night if I was to code something or code my way out of a problem. It's the language that I would use. But what's more important is who I think you are. So today, I started to put together a presentation that would teach you some Ruby, but I wanted to think about who you were in terms of like where you were at in your skills as far as like a Ruby developer. I assume, of course, because you're coming from Chef perspective, like you're coming to the chef.io/webinars, that you are someone that knows Chef. And so I wanted to, firmly structure it within that context, within the context of Chef, and sort of show you around that world. So I assume that you've written some recipes and defined some attributes. You've written resources inside of these recipes. You've maybe converged a note or two, or at least, maybe you've seen some of our introductory content in some way. And you're probably curious about Ruby, or maybe even frustrated with Ruby. So you've spent some time perhaps even doing some of the Learn Ruby or Try Ruby tutorials. You've maybe done or grabbed a book, cracked one open, and went through the first few chapters, understood a few little concepts. You are familiar with other programming languages, that have sort of led you here, but you're still struggling to grasp some of the concepts that really make Ruby the way it is and what makes it so special and why Chef chose to use it for Ruby. So hopefully today, this person, will be the person that I've targeted correctly, and the content will, of course, be delightful for you to enjoy. All right. So we're just doing a few more administrative things before we get started. I just want to make sure well, the interface has now changed. I haven't updated my screenshots, but down at the bottom of the presentation screen, what you're going to see is an Ask a Question area. Well, you're welcome to click on that button and ask a question at any time throughout the presentation. At the end, I'm going to make some time to answer those questions, so about 15 minutes till. I'll answer some questions as we go along. If I can keep my peripheral vision open during it while I'm working through content, I'll be able to sort of answer them as I go along, but it's usually saved to the end. You're also welcome to leave a comment in the Rate This field. So if you go to Rate This, you're welcome to give a rating, but more importantly, you can just add a comment. So it's a great place to just add a comment if you didn't have a question. And you're always welcome to email me at franklin@chef.io, and I would love to get back to you. A lot of times people send me just little notes, feedback, how this relates to their work and what they're doing. I love to get those because it helps me become a better instructor, teacher, trainer, and all those things. I get to learn about those and really, more importantly, connect with all of you. All right. And then, of course, this presentation is going to be available. I believe it's slightly different now. Maybe it's under the details, or maybe there's a slightly different thing now where you can share it. Yeah, under the details tab on the bottom right, you can click on that, and that details now will say, hey, I can share this presentation with my social groups and things like that. The link, of course, that you got in your email when you signed up or whatever, that should bring you back here, or chef.io/webinars, that kind of thing. So please make sure you share this if you find this valuable, useful information. I'd love to know. All right. So without further ado, let's get started with the Ruby Behind Chef. Now, I recently should admit, I was thinking about this. The Ruby Behind Chef sounds really bold. In this case, why the Ruby Behind Chef? And what is the Ruby Behind Chef? Like, could I cover all that content within the 45 minutes or so that we have together? And I realized that was crazy. All right, so I'm not going to do the Ruby Behind Chef. So I'm going to do some Ruby, right? Okay, some Ruby Behind Chef today. And when I say some Ruby Behind Chef, really what I thought would be interesting, instead of diving into some really complex Ruby code, at least the Chef Ruby code that makes up, or the Ruby code that makes up Chef, I thought perhaps a possible version of Chef. I thought what would be really powerful for us to do is actually try to recreate what Chef is doing, ourselves with some Ruby. So we're going to write some Ruby in a possible version of Chef. So maybe how Chef was a long time ago, or how we would implement Chef. And I wanted to see what that would look like. And I think there's a lot that we can learn in there. And I thought, you know, what would be interesting? What if we added a T-Rex enhancement to this? What if we made this, you know, ultra-powered T-Rex enhanced webinar? So I would like to introduce you formally to some Ruby behind a possible version of Chef T-Rex Enhanced webinar. My name is Franklin Weber, and I am the training team lead. I'm here to lead you through this content. All right. So this all comes from me and my new core philosophy. So I just went to Burning Man, and you know, I was sitting there with a bunch of other thought leaders, and we were thought leadering around the camp circle. And we were thinking about different ways in which we could build products. And my way of building a product that I came out of that was MDD. Now, some of you are probably familiar with TDD, test-driven development, maybe even BDD, behavior-driven development. MDD, you're probably scratching your heads. Well, MDD to me is mascot-driven development. So here, I started out with this cute T-Rex toy, and I was thinking to myself, that's what I want to do. I want to make a version of Chef that is T-Rex flavored. And the reason I want a T-Rex flavored Chef is that because I think T-Rex Chef would just be a lot cooler than regular Chef. I mean, chefs nowadays are just kind of the vanilla chef. They're just regular chef, the unleaded chef, the 87 octane chef. You know, what we want is a super powered, awesome chef. And I think some of the features for T-Rex Chef would be this. The killer features that would have is that it'd be killer fast, right? T-Rexes are known for their killer speed, attacking, being aggressive. And then, of course, we'd have a smaller feature set, or tiny features here. All right, so the tiny features. And what I mean is, if we're going to develop this version of T-Rex Chef, and it's going to be better than the existing Chef, is it's going to run faster, right? Because we're not going to load up all the additional other features that are currently present in Chef. And that smaller feature set is really just because our minds at the moment, learning Ruby, don't understand all the sort of possible cases and all the sort of source code that happens to be within Chef. But we can learn a lot in the process of developing T-Rex Chef, or at least parts of T-Rex Chef here today. So that's what I want to do with you, and hopefully you're welcome to join along with me. I'm going to switch over to an editor and my command line in just a moment, but let's get ready to start building T-Rex Chef. Now, the first feature we want to build in T-Rex Chef is probably the most core or fundamental piece of Chef itself, which is parsing a recipe. Right? And so what I was thinking was we need to be able to parse a recipe file. So we're going to parse a recipe file, load it up, and then we want to eventually get to the other things, which is evaluate the core resources, evaluate the resource blocks, you know, the additional details about a resource, and then, of course, we'll have time for questions and wrap-up. I think that's about what we're going to be able to accomplish in the time that we have here today with each other. And we're just going to do this from scratch. So I'm going to start out from a blank terminal with just the Chef DK installed, and we're going to learn a little bit about Ruby along the way. Again, some questions along the way would be great. I've already got some, like, how are you doing today? I'm doing wonderful. I've got a little cup of coffee. The sun is shining. I appreciate that question. Thanks for asking. I really do. All right, so let's get started. So the first and foremost, let's move to the command line. So we're going to parse this thing with Chef. So I've kind of jumped ahead here. Let's load a recipe file. So all I've done is created for myself a directory. So the Ruby behind Chef is the directory that I created. Hopefully that's at a font size that you can read. I'll just make it a little bit bigger here. And within my directory, I need to, of course, have a cookbook, essentially a recipe file that I want to parse. So I'm going to make a cookbooks directory. And within the cookbooks directory, I'm going to generate a cookbook. And it doesn't actually matter what kind of cookbook I generate. I will just default to that generic, one-of-a-kind cookbook Apache. So in this case, I'm just going to do a Chef Generate cookbook. And I'm going to put it in the cookbooks directory. And I'm going to call it Apache. You could call it IAS, whatever you want to do. The whole point is we're just going to start parsing the recipe file from that. And we're going to load it up just with plain Ruby without loading any Chef whatsoever. So here we go. I'm going to load this Apache. So here I've created the Apache cookbook. I believe if you run tree, you'll see I've got a cookbooks directory, and then inside the cookbooks directory, I have a single cookbook. You're welcome to change it to whatever value you like. I said Apache is just that generic, not one-of-a-kind cookbook that we oftentimes use for our help, essentially for our helper sort of default that we go to. Great. So let's now start making T-Rex Chef. So this is kind of daunting. Like, where do you go? Where do you start? What do you do? Well, let's just make a Ruby file. So I'm going to touch trexchef.rb. So that's going to be the file that we're going to start all of our whole implementation of T-Rex Chef in. And eventually, of course, it'll be a multi-file. We'll put it in a gem. We'll release it. We'll have our own roadshow, our own T-shirts. You know, eventually it's going to overtake Chef completely. But right now, T-Rex Chef needs to start in a single Ruby file. And now I'm going to use my editor to open up my T-Rex Chef file and actually my entire directory structure. So if you've seen some of the other videos that I've done, editors are important. And one of my favorite features in editors is the ability to open up the entire directory and directory structure. So you see here on the left-hand side, this is probably a little small, but you see here on the left-hand side, well, it's not blocked by that sort of helper there, this sort of widget. What you see is that I've got essentially the file structure on the left-hand side. I've got my cookbooks directory, my single cookbook, and of course my trexchef.rb file. So here we are, the blank page. Let me pause just for a moment here. So you've got this file, and what we want to do, remember, is our goal. Our goal is to load a recipe file. So I like to write this out just kind of an English way of saying it, English way of sort of expressing it, just from my natural language of writing this. So choose your natural language and to write this out. So we've got to load the recipe file from the Apache cookbook, right? And that recipe file that we're going to load is load the default recipe file, because I think that's the only one that happens to be present within there, right? And I think what we'll just say is let's just display the contents of that file at the moment. Display the contents of the recipe file. That's what we want to see. Great. All right, so this looks pretty good. All right, so that seems like the right idea to me. I've got the right sort of thought, right? Load the default recipe file from the Apache cookbook and display the contents. So how would I actually load the contents there? Well, to load a file or to work with files within Ruby, you're going to use the file class. For those of you that have spent some time working with Chef, you have probably seen file.exist. Maybe even you've seen file read or something like that. Let me take you to the source code implementation, or actually, excuse me, the documentation of this. So I'm going to take you to rubydoc.info. So rubydoc.info/standardlib. It's kind of small to see, but if you can see this rubydoc, actually, I'll go here, I'll write this out. So I'm going to use rubydoc.info, and I'm going to go to this website, and I'm going to look at the standard library. stdlib doesn't stand for a venereal disease. No, what happens to be is a standard library. Inside of here, there's a number of libraries that are core to Ruby. So, or I should say essential to the Ruby deployment. So when you actually install Ruby on your system through the Chef Development Kit, you actually get all of Ruby, which is all of these sort of libraries that you can look at. The core library is the one that's loaded by default, this core one right here. The other ones are ones that you can load after the fact. So they're ones that like take care of CSV parsing, they take care of date management, and a number of other sort of additional libraries. If you work with other languages, usually what happens is very similar, like Java, you have a standard sort of set of, you've got a whole big library that gets shipped with it, but you load a standard set of information. So I'm going to look at the core library. On the left-hand side, I will be able to type in class names. So by default, it's already selected the classes. So I can type in the class name that I'd like to open up. So I'm going to type in file, and then it's going to filter down to the file that I want here. So this file resource is really an abstraction on a file object system. Now, you'll see here it also includes something called file test, which says, hey, I've got file.exist and a number of other things. What's interesting is if you come through here and read the documentation that talks about it, it's going to start with the constant summary, which is not really the place that you want to be interested in. A lot of times you're interested in the class method summary, which is something like you can say capital F file dot what. You know, in this case, you could change the ownership, change the mode, set the base name, figure out the at time, you know, all these different things that are possible with the file class itself. figure out the stats and information with it, rename a file. A lot of times what's difficult is you can't see all the methods that you would hope to see here, right? And the reason for this, and there's a little tip at the beginning, it says the file is an abstraction of this, and it's closely associated with the IO class. So file inherits a lot of content, a lot of features from the IO object. If we do a search on the page for the read method, you'll see that a number of things pop up, and we'll see that we finally get down to methods inherited from IO. And you'll see there's some read character, read lines, and a bunch of other sort of methods that are available to us. We can click on that one, and it's going to take us to the class for IO. And that's actually going to tell us a lot more information about how to read from a file. Now, I'm just going to shortcut and switch over here. So let's load the default recipe. You use file, and there's a number of ways you can do it. I like just using file.read for small files. Of course, if you're working with larger files that you need to actually stream the contents or look at a line by line, that's a possibility. But in this case, we're just going to load the recipe file completely as a whole. And what we need to do is specify the path of the file. So I'm going to say it's a recipe file, whatever that recipe file happens to be. The recipe file is going to be the path to our file itself, the recipe file. So from our current position, from the trexchef.rb file, I'll need to specify a path to that recipe file. And I believe that path is going to be, actually, I think we're outside the cookbooks directory, into the Apaches directory, into the recipes directory, and then it's the default.rb. And let's just make sure that happens to be there. And of course, before we do this file read, we could set up something like the file.exist, right? So I could say, if the file does exist, question mark, we could do this code, right? So I could say something like this. Otherwise, we could write a message which tells us, which says, hey, could not find the file, recipe file. So I'm doing some quick things here. I'm using some if-else logic to essentially say, if this happens to be true, then accomplish this work. Otherwise, do this. Now, a lot of times what people do is sort of switch this around, and this is something that I would probably do right now, is just say, if the file does not exist, so if it does not exist, or you can use either way of this, you can write this many different ways. Another possible way besides if not is you can say unless. If the file does not exist, then display this message, and we could just say, why don't you exit the application, right? Otherwise, continue on, which you do is just read the file contents. Now, if everything looks good, we want to display the contents of the file. And in this case, we should probably store the contents that we're actually receiving in. So I'm just going to say this is the recipe content stored here. Yeah. And then I'm going to store the recipe contents. And now I'm going to use this common method, which is Ruby, which is just a puts method. This puts method allows us to output to the screen or output to our standard out. And in this case, I'm going to show this right here. So let's say recipe contents. So this should hopefully work if we've got the path correctly defined. So here we are, we're making sure that the file exists. If it doesn't, we exit. And then we're reading the file contents and then displaying this out to the screen. There was a good question that I just saw, and my peripheral vision did happen to catch it. It says, why do you have this, this hash symbol between the file and the read? Well, that's a great question. At least with rubydoc.info, the hash symbol usually means that it's an instance method versus a class method. So actually, if you scroll up to the top here, there's a differentiation. Oh boy, so many examples. Let me actually go back to the file class. There's class methods, which are usually represented by this dot in between. And then there's instance methods, which have the hash symbol in between them. This one seems a little different. I'm not sure why. Really, this probably should be a dot because I'm calling it right on the class. So this is what I would call a class method. But in the documentation there, it shows it as essentially an instance method. So that's the reason why. All right, so we've got this so far. Let's run this code to make sure it's working for us. So I'm going to put this at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to put our code here to the top of the screen. So remember, that's our recipe file we're going for. We're going to read the contents in. And I'm just going to execute a Ruby file by running Ruby and then the name of the file. You may need to put chef exec Ruby T-Rex chef to run it, but Ruby happens to be on my path. I'm not sure which Ruby that runs. I believe it's running my chef DK one. But if you always want to make sure, you can run that right there. All right, so that looks right. I think we've got that correct. if it displays the contents of the recipe file, it looks like it's displaying it correctly, right? The contents of my recipe file, if I look at cat, cookbooks, Apache, recipes, default.rb, it is. It's just a comment block at the top. So we've done the first goal. We've read a recipe file. So T-Rex Chef is already, look how fast it is. I mean, it's amazing. It's just so quick. It doesn't do anything, but at least reads the contents of that file. So that's what file is really good for. If you ever need to do any sort of file reading, manipulation, existence, also modification, stat, anything like that, look to this file class. And that's something that's really powerful because when you first start playing with a programming language, at least for scripting in these, for these situations, you want to be able to manage files and usually load files and things like that. Now, the last part, or the second part actually, we need to do is look at actually parsing the contents of that file. So if I look at our goal here, I think it was to load a recipe file, but what we want to do is evaluate that content of that file. So we don't want to just output the content. That was a good start. We want to evaluate the contents of it. So we want to take the text inside of that recipe file that we just loaded, and we want to evaluate it because it does happen to be Ruby code. And what we can use is this eval method. So this eval method is available everywhere. It's actually on this kernel module. And I want to pause for a moment just to kind of show you this kernel module because the kernel module is really powerful. It has a number of methods that you probably take for granted when working with, essentially with Ruby. It's got a number of instance methods. Like, remember I wrote that exit method, and I said, hey, if you want to exit your application, you can. Well, that exit method is brought to us by the kernel method. This eval is present because of that. And I also mentioned puts being a very popular way of outputting information. Well, the puts method is also present on kernel. When I first started working with Ruby, I was completely confused on where these methods came from. And the reason for them is that the kernel module is included in the class object. So its methods are available in every Ruby object. So they seem like global methods. I used to think that puts and exit and all that stuff were global methods or methods that are just sort of existed out everywhere. But they do. They exist everywhere. They just happen to be attached to every object. And that's a very important distinction than sort of just thinking of a global method. These methods are actually attached to every object within Ruby. So you can always call puts or exit, and you can always replace that functionality if you want to. Well, eval is the one that we're interested in, and it's very simple. Eval, essentially, all we need to do is replace the puts method with this eval method, and what's going to happen is we're going to evaluate the contents of that recipe file, and it's going to read it for any Ruby, and it's going to assume that it's all great Ruby, and then it's going to show us the output from that. So I'm going to rerun this code, and I'm going to show probably nothing is going to appear, because if we look at the Ruby code inside of the recipe, we always see its comments. So I don't see anything that's going to actually execute. We shouldn't receive an error, but we shouldn't also receive any output anyways as well. There's a good question. Can we use a file class to rename a file with a variable, say with a date timestamp? Definitely you could. You could rename a file. Take a look at that file class. There is a rename inside of there, and I definitely think you can do that. I've done that in the past. There's a rename. There's also another class called file utils, which I can also send me an email or leave your contact information. I'll get back to you with that. All right. So here we are. I'm evaluating the contents of the recipe file. I feel pretty powerful. We've got this. We're reading in the contents of a recipe file. Of course, a recipe contains no content whatsoever, no resources. And so that's going to lead us into our next goal. So we've got our first feature finished. We're actually reading a recipe file. True, it's only one recipe file. It's not being specified by a run list. It's hard-coded in the recipe. But again, we've got to start somewhere. So let's move on to our next feature, which is evaluating the core resources. Let me just give you a quick refresher of what a resource looks like. So a resource has a type. Generally, the name right there, that's the type of it. So in this case, it's the file resource. It has a name, which usually follows after the file type or the type of the resource, in this case, after file. And then it usually has an action associated with it. Sometimes the action is implied. It's not present, so we know what it is by just a pure sort of understanding of least surprise. And then a lot of times they have additional properties. So in this case, a file resource may be created with some sort of content. In this case, we'd be creating the hello.txt file with the content hello world, right? So that's how a resource works, or at least that's how it looks, and you've written one before. We're going to focus on the core resources. So I'm going to move back into my recipe, my default recipe file, and I'm going to add a package. And I'm just going to write out one resource that I think would work for us. So I'm going to write out package Apache, and I would assume, of course, that this would install the package Apache or Apache 2 or HTTPD, whatever you want to do. Really, this is just our sort of T-Rex chef that we're kind of playing with. Eventually, when we get to the full working power, it would actually install based on our application or based on our operating system and things like that. Right now, it doesn't matter too much what you specify here. Okay. Now I'm going to run our code again, and hopefully I'm going to see an error at this point, right? I'm going to run this, and when I run this, it's going to tell me that there happens to be an error, and it tells me that there's an error here with our T-Rex chef on line 12 in the eval. So that's where we're evaluating the code. Let's go back here. Here's line 12. There's that evaluation right there, right? So that's our eval, okay? So we have the eval that's not working. It tells us that the undefined method package for main object. And then it tells us that the code that we happen to load the recipe happens to specify package, and we currently have not defined a package method, right? So it says undefined method package. So this is something that's really powerful. If you've worked with Chef in any way, shape, or form, when we say resources and we say this is the type of the resource, really what we're doing is we're defining a method. So this happens to be a method. For some of you working from other languages, this doesn't look like a method. This looks like maybe a key value pair, or some sort of relationship between these two. What's fun with Ruby is that you can include the other symbols that you're familiar with. So if you love JavaScript, you love your semicolons, you love your Java, you want to make sure that your parentheses are there, you can. You could actually write this code like this. And there's nothing stopping you. Ruby's going to evaluate the same. It's still going to give us the same error message. What it does do for some people is it makes it clear that this is actually a method that's being invoked. But with Ruby, there's a lot of assumed things about it. And we're assuming that we understand this is a method. And what I really like about this is it reduces the clutter. Now, of course, that clutter that we're reducing also creates more cognitive load. It makes us need to understand more of some of these rules that happen to work with Ruby. And that's where that sort of principle of least surprise sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work. And so this is one of those moments where I think maybe it doesn't work. I'm not sure. So let's get moving forward here. Let's actually implement this method. So I'm going to split my screen here and bring this resource down here, down below, just so we get an idea that it's still there. I'm going to return to T-Rex Chef here. And what I need to do then is, let's remove this comment. I think we've got that down. What I want to do is define a method that's going to handle the package. So here's how, actually, let me cut to the little documentation here and I'll show you. So here's an example of a Ruby method with one parameter. So when you define a method, you use the keyword def. What follows afterwards is the name of the method. In this case, if we were to define a method that would match the file resource, we would actually just call that file. And then if we wanted to have a single parameter being provided, we may, and you can name all those parameters. And even in the definition of the function itself or the method itself, these parentheses are optional. So, I could have made the slide and the reference look like this right here. I oftentimes leave the parentheses in when I'm defining it only because it does make it a little bit easier for me to see. Now, that's not all Ruby developers. Some choose to leave that off. I know one in particular, very prominent Ruby developer that leaves it off. And a lot of the Japanese Ruby developers, I think, have left that off or choose to leave that off. So for us, what we want to do is define our Ruby method. So I'm going to return to our editor here. I'm going to define this package method, and I'm going to write this in. And then I'm going to put a puts method here which says installing the package, what package. Let's just run this code again and see what happens. So I've defined a method with no parameters. A lot of times you might feel more comfortable if you put the two parentheses here that show with or without the parameters. In this case, this is just the same as leaving the parentheses off. So when I do have a parameter, I put the parentheses. When I don't have any parameters, I leave them off. Perhaps that's not consistent of me, but that's what I'm familiar with, and that's what I'm comfortable with. All right, so let's just see what's going to happen here. I'm going to run this code again, and I'm going to see another error. It's going to tell me that there's an error again evaluating the code that was loaded up from the recipe. And it tells me that there's a wrong number of arguments, 140, right? So see that 140 happens to be right there. What that means is that I am providing one argument, but my function or method accepts 0 arguments. And so we've got an argument parameter mismatch within essentially our definition and our application of this. If we had simply written the word package, right, without any values whatsoever, it would have worked, or at least would show us the value installing the package and then give us our error. But that's not what we want, right? We need the name of the package. That's core to our resource definition. So I'm going to provide that first parameter here. That's going to be the name of the package. And I'm going to say installing the package called name. Let's do that right there. All right, so we're going to build, perhaps with our time here, only a read-only or perhaps an audit version. So Prereq Chef will only be able to tell us what it's going to do, but not yet do what it's going to do. So again, the limitations of our time here in 45 minutes, we got to make sure that we can, get as much coverage as we can. And later, in maybe another follow-up series, we could actually implement what this looks like underneath the covers. Okay, so that looks pretty good, right? We see that we're installing the package called HTTPD, and I feel like we've got package, right? And if I think about core resources, I think package, template, and service. So let's go through and implement template. So template usually would be something like var httpd/index.html. We'd probably load from that content from a template, so this would be the source location, right, or something like that. We may choose whatever we want to choose. This is our version, but I think to maintain the compatibility with Chef, we'd say, hey, this happens to be, source, I believe. So we specify the source location. This would be something like index.html.erb. And then if we had a service, we'd also define that. And that service would be something like, hey, let's start the HTTPD service, and let's write out an action. And we'd say something like start and enable. So we'd have an action that provides 2 options, 2 options being provided to that. Okay, so you'll see we're a very similar situation as we were before. We have 2 new resources. They don't quite exist, so we're going to see 2 new error messages, or at least one when we run it. We'll see that we don't have a template method. Let's define that template method. So template name, and I'm really going to copy this content right here and just make this a little bit easier for me. Template, right? And that's kind of right. Installing is not right here. We want to say creating the template at, file location. Name, I'll just leave at the moment. And we'll change this one to service. And this one would say, I'm doing what? I guess we need to figure out the action information. So we'd have to figure this out, starting and enabling maybe. Right? So we'd have to figure this out eventually, but let's just leave this as blankety blank, the service specified by that name. All right, I'm going to rerun the code. Really, I've just defined 2 new methods, and I should see our Prereq Chef, chomping through these challenges as we move through it. So installing the package called HTTPD, creating the template at this location, and then blanking to the service called HTTPD. So in this moment, at least it's reporting this information correctly. The first 2 are pretty straightforward. In this case, using a package, we assume that it's going to create, so our sentence is correct. Our template is also correct. Usually the default behavior with Chef happens to be creating the template. The service one is the trickier one, and that's what we're going to get to in the next section. But let's just pause here and take a moment to celebrate our second feature being completed, which is we've evaluated the core resources that are present there with this section. So let's talk about the next part, which is evaluating the resource blocks. And this is something that is also present in resources that we don't sort of really think about. So really, I'm trying to demystify a lot of what's happening behind Chef, right? So something that isn't clear initially, that this is a method right here. So this file right here is just a method that's being defined somewhere in the bowels of Chef. This is the first parameter that's being provided. What's being provided second is this thing right here, which is really a block. This thing is called a block, and this block is really, I want to call the second parameter that's being provided. And this block is something very similar to what you see here. So, you know, the first parameter is data, right? We're passing data into the system, hello.text. You're probably familiar, if you spent any time working with a programming language, you know, writing some of these functions, passing arguments, you know, which is just static data, names, ages, you know, calculation functions, something like that, say hello to this person. Well, what's really cool in Ruby is that you can also pass a block of data. And a block of data is something very special because a block of data is really, I just want to say, it's very similar to just the sort of static data, like data itself. It's just a block, it's just a unit of code that you can actually execute. So it's like taking a bunch of code, wrapping it up in a present, and then giving it to the function so that it can choose to execute it or not, or in this case, choose to unwrap it and execute it whenever it wants to. A lot of people might call this, or some people might call this, an anonymous function. So if you've worked with other programming languages, anonymous functions really just mean, hey, you're giving me some code, but you haven't named it, but you're passing it around and giving me a reference to that. And so really that's what we're doing within Chef, is that we're passing around a reference to the code. Now the cool part is with Ruby, every method can take a block. Every method can take a block. You don't actually have to specify a parameter to say, hey, can you pass a block to it? It's up to the method to whether it needs to process the block or not. But every method in Ruby can take a block. And I think that's one of its most powerful features, is that every method can take a block, and it's up to the method author to essentially choose whether they want to behave, how they want to behave when they receive a block. A lot of them choose to ignore it, and then the ones that want to do something with it can do something with it. Now, the block that you pass to it is oftentimes just ignored, right? So like I said, it's just ignored. But in the right situations, it can be used. And what's really cool about a block, in this case, if you see this implementation here, is that we're explicitly naming the block here. So we're calling it block. That's just a generic name for it. I didn't have to call it block. I could have called it supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, right? It doesn't have to be this name here. I just happen to call it block. And you actually don't even need to name the block itself. I felt more comfortable naming the block initially when working with Ruby code. And the reason I felt more comfortable is that it made it clear to me what was happening. And when I wanted to unwrap or sort of call that block, you know, execute the contents of the block, I could by using this first version right here. So you see this, it says block.call right there. That's actually how you would call the block or sort of execute the contents of the block. The implicit version, the more like Jedi version, I would say, after you're used to it, is this one right here, which is a bunch of keywords strung together, yield if block given, which means call the block, essentially this right here. Here, we're kind of missing that code. We're saying block call if block is present, right? So if there happens to be a block. But this is just saying yield if block is given. So blocks are always there. If you give it an explicit name, you can actually execute it with a block.call. So let's return back to our recipe, thinking about these blocks, thinking about what's present, thinking about this right here, right? Because, you know, we could add a block to this one, and eventually you might want to, we probably want to provide support for that. But this template resource, when we see the output for this template resource, you'll notice that it didn't tell us anything about where the template was coming from. It says, I'm creating the template for you, but it didn't tell us that, hey, where is the source for it? So let's actually implement that. So here, I'm going to put in that block. And so like I said, I could call it supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. I just generically call it a block. Now, you might be asking, why this little symbol in front of this? You know, what if you didn't put the symbol in front? Well, if you didn't put the symbol in front, Ruby would assume that you meant a second parameter. So it would assume that it means a second parameter here. And, you know, I did say the block is a second parameter. It's sort of like the unsung second parameter. It's this sort of hidden second parameter. And so by adding this little ampersand in front of it, what you're saying is get the reference to this block right here if it happens to be passed in there. Now, I like to think of this as a bow. I know it's an ampersand, but I like to think of it really like a block is being passed to this function, and that this block is gift wrapped. It's got a bow on it, and it's up to us to unwrap that block. And we can unwrap that block if it's been present. So we could say block.call. And this is just going to execute the contents of that block inside this template method. Now, if you're watching and following along, you can add this block.call method, and we can do that for the service one. But let's just start here and see what kind of output we get when we run. All right, so when I execute this again, I see that we're installing the package and we're creating the template, but you know what we see? We see there's an undefined method source for main object. So why do we get that? Well, if we look back here, there is a source method. So here's something that's also powerful to know, is that, of course, the properties specified within a resource are actually methods as well. So really, these are just methods as well. So we don't have to, in this case, this source method right there, that's really a source method. It just happens to be invoked inside of this template block that's being passed. And so really for us, that's all we would need to do to define the source method. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But here the source method would take a name. It might even take additional parameters. We would just say using the source from here, and we just say name. Source, we'll just say using the source file, like that. And we specify that name here. So let's execute this again. And you'll see now I have a source method. So when it gets to that point and the block gets called, the contents of that block get executed. And so the block comes in, right? This block gets passed. So first parameter, second parameter. They come into the template method. The first parameter gets inserted here into this sentence. And then the second parameter, this whole block just gets executed. And then when that gets immediately executed, there's a source method in that. And so that gets called with the name, and it tells us that using the source here. So that's it, right? So let's go to the second one, which is the service one. I'm going to use the implicit version, which is going to be, hey, I'm going to yield if block given. This is where there's a lot of keywords being thrown in. Yield is a keyword within Ruby. Block given with a question mark is a keyword, and if, of course, is a keyword. You could write this out as this: if block given, yield, end. But this is that sort of one-liner that's very popular, that's borrowed from Perl. So yield if block given. And we'll write the service one, and I think we should see another error message as well. Undefined method action for main object. So we can solve this problem by defining an action. We could say, here's our list of actions, right? Here's our actions that we're going to take. We might call this actions or list or whatever happens to be. Taking the following actions, and we'll just say actions right here. We'll put that list here. We execute it. So there's our service. So we still would need to spend some time sort of saying, using the source file or moving this sort of start and enable and sort of saying start the service called HTTP, enabling the service called HTTP. But these are just the two ways you can kind of see the blocks being used inside of Ruby. And so really, there's a little bit more to what's going on here, but this is a pretty much at its core, what is taking place when you define resources within a recipe. There's definitely some stuff that we're going to talk about in just a moment, but hopefully these concepts really sort of demystify what is taking place when you look inside of a recipe file. All right, so let's talk about a little bit about that block itself. So what is that block? Well, the block, when you pass it, becomes a proc. And you can actually look at all the available methods on the block that gets passed, that gets turned into a proc by looking up the proc class. So the proc class is going to show you a little bit of an example code that talks about what can be done. Here's all the methods that are available on this. I happen to be using call, which is the one method I think is really powerful, but you can do a lot of different things with this if you're interested in it, to string and other things like that. You can find out the arity of this, which means how many parameters it might have, et cetera, et cetera. We can take a look at that, but what I mean is we can take a look at it inside of here. So I'm going to use pry for a moment to kind of take a look inside of here. Let's look inside the template method, what we wrote here. Let me use pry, so I'm going to require pry, and I'm going to use binding.pry. We're going to pause here and see what's going on with it. So I'm going to run this again. It's going to pause at this moment. I'm going to ask what the block class happens to be, and there happens to be a block. I can ask the methods on the class as well. And so you'll see here is call. I can do some almost like hash notation. I can look up some values within this. I can compare it to other things. There's the yield method to proc, arity. All the methods are available within it. So I can take a look at it here in case you don't want to look at the source code. So that's something that's kind of useful, right? So you can see that it's a proc if you ever needed to understand what's taking place. Now, we wouldn't be able to really call it anything. And the reason why sometimes it's good to explicitly name things is even if I added a pry line right here in between the service, I would not be able to see the contents of the block or sort of access it or ask the methods of it, ask what parameters it might take, the arity of it, those kind of things. I wouldn't be able to gain access to that. So that should solve for us the final problem, which is evaluating the resources within the block. So there's some important things that I just want to drive home in the last minute that we have here before we go into questions, which is talking about context. So within Ruby, there's a lot of structure and power within the methods. We can pass blocks to any method, but really we have a problem or a possible problem when working with this code right here. This T-Rex chef is going to start looking a little crazy inside of this method, right? So this thing is package, source, template, action, those kind of things. How do we define this action within another context? When we're talking about an action related to a service versus an action related to a template versus action related to essentially a package. Well, the whole idea of context is a powerful thing within Ruby. So there was a minor note in one of the slides previously that talked about, in this case, blocks themselves and procs, which are going on. So let's go back to this Ruby block right here. Well, actually, sorry, it's the proc that I think I want to store that information. Yeah, so procs are objects. They're blocks of code. Once bound, the code may be called in different contexts and still access these variables. So context is a powerful word here. And understanding what a context means is something that is something in programming languages that some of you may be familiar with. So when you've worked with programming languages before, a lot of times context or scope was a very important word to understand. So when we think about scope, we think about when things are defined, say like this recipe file variable right here. When we define this recipe file variable right here, it's a local variable that's present not before it's defined, only at the point it's defined and afterwards, or perhaps just afterwards. So this recipe file is present. We will then can use it anywhere else inside of this file as we continue along, right? We can use it within line 10, we can use it on line 5, we can use it on line 6. The thing is, we can't use it within inside of a method itself, right? So if I were to say, from this recipe file, right? So if I were to define this inside of here, this is a different context or different scope in which you're working. I'd see an undefined local variable or method recipe file. And that's because we've changed the context we happen to be in at the moment. So it's important to understand that blocks are really powerful units of code that you can pass. But what's also really powerful of them as units of code is that you can execute them in a different context. So you can kind of like take this code, right? Kind of like you can take yourself and perhaps you can brush your teeth, you can shower, you can get dressed, and you can do this in your home, but you can also do this in places you visit, other locations you go to. And blocks are very similar to that. Blocks are these things that you can kind of take, they have their function or their functionality defined within them, and you can put them in one context and execute them there, but you can also move them to other contexts as well. If we had a little more time, I'd move you into that category. I'd show you how we can actually move a block to a different context. And that's something that you actually see when working with different things. So let me kind of show you that as a demonstration of just what it looks like in Chef. And if we had a little more time with T-Rex Chef, we could totally look at that. So I'm going to show you the Tomcat cookbook, which is just one that I created when working with the Joy of Automating series, this educational series I put on YouTube that teaches you chef things. Inside of here, let's just clean this up. I was doing a little bit of work inside of here, kind of talking about this before with someone else, showing them that around, right? So let's just look at this this user method right here. I'm going to set up a breakpoint right here, and I'm going to specify this require pry, binding.pry, and I want to show you a literal thing about context right now. So I'm going to run chef exec rspec, which is just going to load the code and run the recipe and pause for me in that moment I need. I don't actually need the test to fail or pass. I just need to show you the context that's present. Okay, so we pause first at this first breakpoint, which is line 8. And it's going to tell us the context we happen to be in when we pause it right there. And it's going to tell us that we happen to be in the chef recipe context. So for all intents and purposes, we're in the country of recipe, which happens to be inside of the chef, right, module. So this recipe thing, This is where if we were to execute a method or execute the concept of the method, we would now be in this moment. So it's looking for, user inside of the recipe class. It's looking for package inside of this recipe class. It's looking for all those resources. Now I'm going to exit, which is going to send us to our next breakpoint. You notice now we are in a different context. On the command line here, you'll see that it says pry has moved us into a different context right here. And that's because this block right here, while defined in this initial context, is actually shifted into a completely different context whatsoever. So it's moved into another location. It's actually moved into a very specific one, which is related to a user. And in that user class, we have very specific methods like manage home, shell, group, and home, and things like that. So there's a lot of different powers in these blocks. We can move them around, and it's something that took me a long time to understand. All right, so let me pause now for some questions, and let's spend some time just doing some questions and any sort of things like that. Like I said, in the bottom left-hand corner, there's ask a question. You're welcome to pop a question in there at this moment. And of course, if you just want to leave a comment, there's the rate this, and of course, you can email me as well. So let me look at some of the questions that I see here. I answered the one about the file read, which is great. All right, so we'll look at this one. Are there any unit testing frameworks that you would recommend for Ruby development? Yeah, I would definitely recommend, well, Minitest is a good one. So there's one that ships with Ruby itself, which is just kind of like a Ruby test, and then there's Minitest, which kind of adds some functionality on top of it. And then I would say, though, if you're going to spend any time working with, in this case, working with, and I'm going to exit this out, Ruby itself, I would say get into using RSpec, because RSpec is going to be very similar to chef-spec or in-spec that you're currently working with. So if we were going to build some tests for our current T-Rex chef.rb file, you can use RSpec, and you can say rspec-init. It'll automatically create a spec and spec helper directory for you. So you'll see here, it creates that spec helper for you. And then we could, in this case, within our spec directory, create our T-Rex chef spec.rb file. And then we could write some T-Rex chef spec that we'd actually write. So we just write our test that would just prove the functionality works the way it is. So RSpec is a great way to start. There's some tutorials, of course, on RSpec. And if you spent any time working with it with chef spec or in spec, you'll be ahead of the game, and it's going to help you with that work there. Is there a doc that lists the topics of Ruby that one needs to be familiar with to write cookbooks? That's a hard thing to understand. So is there a doc of list of topics? Because when you work with particularly Ruby, or I guess with Chef and particularly writing Ruby, is that there's a lot of special things that are taking place. I mean, understanding methods is probably the core, and that's why I focused on it. Understanding blocks is the second probably big important thing that you're going to take a look at and understand. There's some other concepts like these things right here. There's one that I left out in the interest of time that I'll answer this question here. There's method calls, and method calls can take lazy hashes is what I call them. Lazy hashes are present within a function call or method call, and with that method call, you can provide a hash to it, but you can optionally put the curly braces here that show that it happens to be a hash. What I like about that, and what a lot of Ruby developers like about that, is that it's less characters to type, and what makes it kind of cool is that it kind of looks like name parameters or key value pairs instead of sort of the structure of other details that go along with it. It's a pretty common one that you might see. I think, yeah, here's another example of that. If you've used the directory resource, and on Windows, you've used probably the write property. And that writes property allows you to specify one parameter, which is essentially the initial write, two, which is the users, the principal, whoever is going to be gain that access. And then you have the ability to specify additional parameters after the fact. What's really cool about this, and let me just turn on wrapping so it'll show it this way, is that, what's nice is you can have a bunch of these sort of name parameters after the fact. And this saves you from having to define a bunch of parameters that may or may not be there, right? So these options are truly optional parameters. These are options you can specify but don't have to specify. So there's a third concept that I think we'd take a look at, which is sort of that lazy hash within methods itself. spending more time within that. But I don't know of a good resource that would teach you all about what needs to be present in Chef, because, as I look at everything here, I go, well, you would need to know about, arrays. It's important. Arrays are important to understand how they're built and how they're used. You probably want to take some time to look at symbols, right? So symbols would be another important thing. Maybe I can make that list here. So definitely the methods, blocks, being passed in a method, the lazy hash when working with methods. Hashes themselves are, of course, important. Arrays would be really powerful to understand because you got to know the arrays, and symbols are probably truly important things that you want to grab. All right. So hopefully that answers it. If you need more assistance, or if you'd like to help me create that doc, just email me, and I'd love to help work through that with you. Because of course, I've got that expertise bias. I stare at the code and I forget certain things that might be something that might need to be present there. So here's a question that says, is standard Chef a Ruby DSL or just native Ruby? What is a Ruby DSL anyway? So DSL stands for domain specific language. So let me copy this question here. Oh, I forgot. I like to do that. I like to copy the question. Here's the question. So is standard Chef a Ruby DSL or just native Ruby? What is a Ruby DSL anyways? So the important thing is DSL is the domain-specific language, right? In case that's your question there, but I think you've got that or understand that. Chef is really just built on top of Ruby, exactly like we were doing it here. So when we started defining this content right here, somewhere within Chef, there is some code that actually loads up the recipe file based on the run list. It loads it up, and then it loads the appropriate methods that define the thing, and it really makes this look like a domain-specific language, but honestly, it's really just Ruby. You're writing Ruby code. It's just you're writing Ruby code, and there's a bunch of things already preloaded for you, so you don't have to load them. You don't have to say require at the beginning of it. Essentially, it's just taking care of all the prepackaging, all the the preparation before you actually execute this code. So it makes it look like you're writing a scripting language or just the the code that you want to write. When honestly, and you are, right? You just let you write that. But in the background, there's really just a lot of Ruby code loading up all the stuff behind the scenes and allow you to do this stuff almost effortlessly. So is standard Chef a Ruby DSL? Yeah, it's definitely a Ruby DSL. And it's also native Ruby. So that's something to be careful. It is native Ruby. It is also a DSL as well. What is the best way to ease the transition of an ops person? Oops, I didn't copy that right. Oops, excuse me. What is the best way, here's the question, to ease the transition of an ops guy, or I'd say an ops guy, gal, or in between, or whatever your sort of pronoun happens to be. What is your best way to try and learn Chef and Ruby? I'd like to offer that in just the final section. So when I do a wrap up, I'll give you this type of thing. Is T-Rex Chef a new tool? Is it production ready? Unfortunately, as you can see from the end of this webinar, it's definitely not production ready. Perhaps not yet. Maybe it's as production ready as some other tools out there, but not yet, not at the end of this presentation itself. But this is a great question to sort of transition into some of the other ones, some of my resources that I'm going to give you. So what's the best way to ease that transition here? And my suggestion for the best way to ease the transition is to, number one, take a look at these attachments. And actually, if you start using the attachments, I made a mistake. Some of the attachments are going to take you to a website, and I'm actually going to click on one of those right here. If you go to this one called Practicing Ruby, it's going to take you to a blank page called exorcism.io, but I assume that they had secured the page, but it's in fact not. I made the mistake on that. They'll be fixed after the presentation, but what I strongly encourage you to do is go to this website right here. This website is exorcism.io. I worked with Katrina Owen early in its development, and she, of course, has taken it further with lots of contributions with other individuals to make it a great website for you to learn programming languages. Within this website, you go through, you choose your language that you want. Ruby was the first one ever created, and so if you look at it, it's probably, yeah, the Ruby's here. It's got probably the most problems. Oh no, F# got the most problems. Well, it was one of the first ones here, and it's got quite a few problems that you can work through. What I love about the available exercises on here is that it gives you a test suite to work on this. So it's not really going to ease an ops person's way into Chef, or Ruby, but it really is going to ease your way into Ruby. So if you're familiar with working sort of a test-driven development way, and it shows you how to do this. It tells you to fetch the exercise, configure everything, walks you through installing Ruby, but you don't have to do that. You've already got that. It probably provides a number of resources to kind of get you going, which I really like. And what's great about it is that when you're done, when you solve the problem, it's not just like any other sort of website where you solve the problem and you're finished with it. The cool part is that you can upload your work that you've completed to the website and get feedback on that. So you could see someone's implementation, you could see your implementation, and you can ask people to give you feedback on it, which I think is truly powerful. And that's one of the most important features. So I strongly encourage you to check out exercism.io. It's a great way to get feedback and level up your programming skills. I showed you the Ruby documentation. I think it's an okay resource, particularly when you start using file, kernel, and other things. I think it's really powerful. You'll want to keep it open when you start working with it. The examples aren't great, but they can be useful. And then for those of you that want to learn a little bit more about maybe how Chef is built underneath the covers, take a look at Metaprogramming Ruby 2. So this book is available on Amazon or Prog. It's written by a good friend of mine. I really love this book. And this is something that when I first started making the transition to how is Ruby different from other languages? How is it so powerful? And what are the things that people are doing with it? This is a book that really opened my eyes to that. And so it's a fairly advanced book in terms of it assumes you know some basic knowledge with Ruby, but it's truly impressive in terms of what it shows you and presents to you. A question that sometimes comes up is, of course, my terminal. I'd like to just provide that information if you're interested in it, and that's all present there. So if you need any of that information, if you have a question about that, that's there. So I want to thank you for coming to this hour-long session. Hopefully you learned a little bit about demystifying what is actually taking place inside of recipes. Please leave any comments or feedback about this, and we can go into further sessions, or more sessions in the future. We can go into further detail. And hopefully T-Rex Chef will become production ready in the near or immediate future, perhaps with your help. So thank you again. Have a wonderful day. Happy chefing.